Hello and welcome to Political Influences from What's in It for Africa, where we speak to those shaping the current affairs landscape between EU and Africa. On this month's episode, we're going to tackle the path to Africa's industrial revolution. So how is Africa doing in its path to an industrial revolution? Well, the continent's share of global exports only rose around 1% between 1970 and 1980, and since then has been on a downward trend. Also, recent figures actually state that the continent's current share of global exports is only around 2.4%. Also, the continent's share of global manufacturing output is only around 1.5%. This is despite strong economic growth, which has been the basis for a strong Africa Rising narrative. Now, these figures have meant that politicians, media and business leaders have begun to ask themselves the question not only when Africa's industrial revolution will begin, but also if it can. So we talked to EU trade policy consultant Zama Nkosi about exactly how the EU-Africa relationship plays a role in Africa's industrialization. Thank you for joining us on Political Influences from What's in It for Africa, Zama Nkosi.
Thank you very much for having me, Uzo.
So let's start off with asking, how can African countries make industrialization a reality?
I think the first thing to consider, or one of the biggest things to consider in the context of EU-Africa relations, is to ensure that when African countries are represented in trade negotiations, that they center their industrialization concerns within the structure of the trade agreement. And that also means in multilateral forums as well, that these industrialization concerns about policy space, about supporting infant industries, that those are really centered and put forward as being key items for how the continent and for how those specific countries see their future.
Okay. And the UN Economic Outlook for Africa report last year, 2015, states that industrialization facilitates trade and trade also facilitates industrialization. So to what extent do you agree or disagree with this in the EU-Africa trade context?
I think that in order to achieve industrialization, you need to have trade, but you also need to have the internal institutions, the internal skills, etc., in order to make this a reality as well. So I don't necessarily see it as being that trade can facilitate industrialization. I think that's fine, but under certain conditions that this would be the case. I don't think it's that clear cut as you've just mentioned from the UN report.
And the Africa-EU partnership, for example, it's based on developing the economic and political ties between the two continents. And one of its main objectives is the industrialization of the African continent. So after nearly a decade of this partnership, where is the evidence that it has delivered?
I think that when we try to determine the impact of a partnership on on certain factors or outcomes that we seek in Africa, that we need to take a global perspective, because there are many factors to take into account. There are many partnerships. We have a global economy. We are interdependent, and looking at the European influence on industrialization in Africa, I think would require not just looking at where Africa stands it is now, because where it stands now is a result of many things. But perhaps we could look at our specific programs that the EU is funding in terms of capacity building, skills, training, and that sort of thing. But on the whole, of course, we see that Africa is lagging behind the rest of the world on industrialization. But I do not think that the European partnership on its own is the major or the main contributing factor to this.
Okay. And on the whole, have EU policies, whether it be in development, agriculture, trade, or even investment, made the industrialisation of Africa more or less difficult? So moving away from the Africa-EU partnership and looking, for example, at the fact that importing processed coffee attracts 7.5% charge when it's imported into the EU. Obviously, African producing countries like Cameroon or Kenya, that puts them at a disadvantage if they want to process or import processed coffee. On the other hand, we also have up to 34 African countries, the least developed, which actually benefit from quota and duty-free access into the European Union. So this is a great benefit. So I wanted to get a sense from you, on a whole, although it is very complex, have EU policies made industrialisation in Africa more or less difficult?
Yes, as you've painted, I would agree that it is a very complex picture. I think it depends on many things. I think it depends on the region. I think it depends which sectors you are looking at. Specifically, you mentioned coffee. That's a clear one that we can draw out in those specific countries. But I would say that the EU-Africa partnership as it stands today, its current iteration, I would say it is the most advanced that Africa has ever had in terms of what is possible for industrialization. Because before this, there was a very strong neoliberal agenda where, not really looking at the domestic conditions that should be put in place for the development of the specific economies. So I think there is a shift and slow recognition from the EU as well as the EU-Africa partnership that these issues need to be centralized. Of course, it is not happening at the pace that Africans would like to see, but I think that this is the most advanced that the partnership has ever gone in terms of considering these issues.
And you mentioned economic partnership agreements, and so I'm going to dive a bit more into that. Do you think it's in the interests or the industrialization interests of African countries like Nigeria or Tanzania, for example, to sign economic partnership agreements with the EU? And I ask this because both of these countries have refused to sign the trade deals and have raised concerns that EU imports or EU manufactured products coming into their markets could put their manufacturing industry at a competitive disadvantage. So is it in the industrialization interests to sign?
I think if we look at those specific sectors within the agricultural sector as well as in the manufacturing industry, where Nigeria wants to build this capacity, ensure that it has competitive exports, ensure that it can compete in the global market, also in the European market, that there is a case to be made that these industries may be on the receiving end of some negative impacts. But I do think that the picture of the EPA perhaps needs to be looked at a little bit more wider. But I do see where the interests are there for those specific sectors, that it could definitely harm and impair their development. And I know that support for infant industries is very important to the Nigerian government, to Nigerian industry, and these are very valid concerns within the context of the EPA. But from a more general perspective, I'm not so sure whether that argument holds across the board.
And the economic partnership agreements in general, and I say in general, but actually it's a complex picture because each regional agreement is very different. But actually we've been seeing a very general approach to the discussion. So what do you think is needed to take the discussions on economic partnerships forward so that decisions can be made for the better? So if it's to support industrialization, for instance, what needs to happen in order to move the needle of these discussions?
I think this is quite difficult because many of the agreements are closed. The negotiations are closed, and we're now in the stage of ensuring that they're ratified by the respective parliaments, etc., and undergoing the different procedures. So at this stage, it will be very, very difficult to do anything new. But what African countries can do is to look at what they have, the ones that wish to sign and the ones that wish to implement these agreements. They can look at these agreements. They can determine what these impacts are if they have not done so already, and look at how to stem any possible negative pushback. If African countries say that they want an equal partnership with the EU, that they need to ensure that these offensive interests should not be compromised as well.
Thank you very much for joining us on What's in It for Africa on political influences, Zama Nkosi.
Thank you very much, Uzo.
Thank you for watching Political Influencers, and be sure to keep up to date with What's in It for Africa's news and analysis on our website, Facebook and Twitter pages. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel and check us out on Afroland TV and Quick TV Africa.